You cannot evict us from this house, Odessa.
I didn't say I couldn't, I said I already did. It's dated, it's notarized. It's sitting on that hallway table where you left your gloves.
This is Terrence's home.
It was never his to give away. He told us you signed off on this. He told us the two of you were already finished. Then he told you something that isn't true. Ask him where the papers are. Ask him to show you my signature. He can't, because it doesn't exist.
Let's not do this in front of everybody, Odessa!
You did this in front of everybody. I'm only finishing it in front of everybody.
Hello, everyone. I just need someone to acknowledge receipt.
Subscribe to Milan Folktales if you've ever watched someone build a life on a lie and mistake the silence around them for permission. This is a story about a woman who let people underestimate her for 11 years, and the one afternoon she stopped letting them. 6 years before that afternoon in the foyer, Odessa Whitfield had believed, with the plain, unguarded faith of a woman who had never been given a reason not to, that she and Terrence were building something that would outlast both of them. She had grown up watching her grandmother, Willa Freeman, run a boarding house on the east side of the city with the kind of quiet authority that never needed raising its voice to be obeyed. Willa had bought that boarding house with money she earned taking in laundry and mending for 3 decades, and when she died, she didn't leave it to Odessa outright. She left it in trust, the Willa Freeman Family Trust, with Odessa as trustee and sole beneficiary, because, the attorney had explained gently at the reading, your grandmother said a house given too easily gets treated too easily. She wanted you to hold it the way she held it, with both hands. Odessa sold the boarding house eventually, after years of running it herself while working full-time as a hospital administrator, and used the proceeds, still inside the trust, still under her sole control, on her grandmother's explicit instruction, to buy a 4-bedroom colonial on Ashgrove Lane. She and Terrence moved in together 2 years into their marriage. He never asked how she'd afforded it outright. She never fully explained. It was, in the early years, simply home, a fact so obvious it didn't need documentation between them. Terrence, back then, was not a man anyone would have called entitled. He was ambitious in the ordinary, forgivable way, a man who wanted to be seen as having arrived somewhere, who took visible pride in opening doors for his mother and carrying his sister's groceries up 3 flights of stairs without being asked twice. He worked in commercial real estate development, a business that rewarded confidence and appearances in equal measure, and for years that trait served him well. It also, slowly, began to hollow him out. The first sign, in hindsight, was small. He introduced Odessa at a company dinner as my partner in everything. Well, everything except the house, that's all her. He said it laughing, like a joke about a wife who liked to be in charge of the throw pillows. Nobody laughed harder than his mother, Corinne, who had never once, in 11 years, referred to Ashgrove Lane as anything but the Whitfield house. Corinne Whitfield had married young, buried a husband early, and raised 3 children on a widow's determination that family loyalty was the only currency that mattered. She loved Odessa the way she loved most people who married into the family, conditionally, and only for as long as they remembered whose family it was. Danielle, Terrence's younger sister, had inherited her mother's instinct for hierarchy without her mother's patience for subtlety. She enjoyed being the one who knew things first, who arrived early to family gatherings so she could watch other people walk in. Malcolm, the middle Whitfield sibling, kept mostly to himself, ran a small logistics company out of a warehouse near the interstate, and had a habit of going quiet in rooms where his mother was deciding things for other people. For years, none of it mattered, because the marriage itself was, by any honest measure, good. Terrence brought Odessa coffee before she asked for it. Odessa learned to cook his grandmother's gumbo recipe from a video call with a woman in Baton Rouge neither of them had ever met, just because he mentioned once, offhand, that he missed it. They took Corinne to her chemotherapy appointments together, alternating weeks, without either of them ever suggesting the other should take fewer. Love, Odessa would say later, doesn't announce the moment it starts changing. It erodes the way a foundation erodes, quietly, underneath, long before anyone sees the crack in the wall. The erosion began, she would come to understand, around the time Terrence's business began to struggle. The development firm he worked for lost 2 major contracts in the same fiscal year. His commissions, which had always been the larger share of the household's discretionary income, dried up almost entirely. He started talking, at first vaguely, and then with increasing specificity, about getting out from under someone else's ceiling, about starting something of his own, a boutique development firm with his college roommate Reggie Ashworth, something with his name on the letterhead instead of buried in someone else's org chart. Odessa supported the idea. She helped him build the pitch deck on weekends. She never once asked him not to dream bigger. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know for another year and a half, was that Terrence had already begun describing Ashgrove Lane to Reggie and later to a private lender named Wallace Coker, not as his wife's inherited property, but as an asset he personally owned free and clear. He'd started small, a mention here, a line on an informal net worth sheet there. Nobody checked. Nobody asked to see a deed. Confidence, in rooms like that, was its own form of collateral, and Terrence had always been good at confidence. It was, he told himself, not really a lie. Just a rounding error. He'd fix the paperwork eventually, get Odessa to add his name to the title the way any reasonable spouse would. A formality, nothing more. He never asked her. He told himself that was because he didn't want to burden her while she was already carrying so much at the hospital. The truth, which he did not examine closely enough to notice, was that some small, ugly part of him suspected she would say no, and he had decided, somewhere in the space between ambition and entitlement, that a no he never had to hear didn't really count. Simone Caro entered the story not as a mistress in the conventional sense, but as a marketing consultant Reggie had hired to help brand the new firm. Whitash Development, Terrence's name folded neatly, deliberately, into first position. She was 34, recently out of a long relationship that had ended when her fiancé decided, 3 weeks before their wedding, that he wasn't ready. She was smart, guarded in the specific way people are guarded after being blindsided once, and good at her job in a way that made Terrence feel, for the first time in 18 months, like a man who was winning at something. Their relationship did not begin as an affair, not technically, not at first. It began as long work dinners that ran later than they needed to. It began as Terrence telling her, over the second of those dinners, that his marriage had been basically over for a while now. We're just working out the logistics. It was a lie so smooth he almost believed it himself by the third time he said it. By the time it became physical, 6 months later, Simone believed, genuinely, and not unreasonably, given what she'd been told, that she was not breaking anything that wasn't already broken. Terrence had shown her photographs of Ashgrove Lane on his phone and said quietly, "The way men say things they want remembered. That house is going to need somebody in it who actually wants to build a life there." He never once told her the house belonged to his wife's grandmother's trust. He never once told her Odessa had built that house's value into a hospital career and a decade of mortgage payments and grief and forgiveness that Simone knew nothing about. A lie only needs to be believed by one person to start doing damage. It needs to be believed by a family to become a war. Corinne found out about Simone before Odessa did. Danielle saw the two of them at a restaurant downtown and reported back with the barely contained delight of a woman delivering gossip she'd waited years to have. Corinne's first reaction was not outrage on her daughter-in-law's behalf. It was, instead, a strange and immediate calculation. If her son's marriage was ending, whose side would the house land on? She asked Terrence directly. He told her, the same lie, refined now through repetition, that Odessa had basically agreed the marriage was over, that there'd be a settlement, that the house would end up his, that he didn't want to talk about the details because it was still painful. Corinne, who had spent decades believing that family protected its own, no matter the cost to outsiders, chose to believe him completely. She told herself she was choosing loyalty. She did not examine, even privately, why loyalty always seemed to point in the direction that benefited her son. Danielle believed it, because believing it let her finally say the things about Odessa's quiet independence that she'd swallowed for a decade. She always thought she was better than us, always so private about her money, never once let anyone see the deed to that house. Malcolm believed it more reluctantly. He'd always liked Odessa, but he also knew from 20 years of watching his mother operate that questioning the family narrative out loud rarely ended well for the one doing the questioning, and he had a business of his own he didn't want dragged into a family war. So he said nothing. Silence, he told himself, wasn't the same as agreement. It was Corinne who first suggested, gently, that Terrence should start bringing Simone around properly. No sense hiding a good thing. It was Corinne who organized the dinner. It was Corinne who, 3 weeks later, stood in the foyer of Ashgrove Lane in her good coat, believing completely that she was standing in her son's house, watching her daughter-in-law hand a folder to a deputy like a woman closing a door that had, in her understanding, already been closed for months. She had no idea the door had never been Terrence's to close. 2 months before the eviction notice, Odessa still didn't know about Simone. What she knew was smaller and stranger. A letter from a title insurance company addressed to Terrence, forwarded to their house by mistake, referencing a property assessment for collateral verification on a loan application. She knew the address on the letter. It was hers. She sat with that letter for 3 days before she said anything to anyone. This was, she would later admit, her deepest flaw. Not naivety exactly, but a lifelong instinct to avoid confrontation until confrontation became unavoidable, inherited from a childhood where peace in the house had always mattered more than being right. She had spent 11 years choosing not to ask hard questions of the man she loved, telling herself that trust meant not needing proof. She called her grandmother's old attorney, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had handled the trust since Willa's death, and who Odessa still spoke to twice a year out of habit and affection. "He's trying to use the house as collateral," Denise told her, after pulling records, her voice careful in the particular way of someone delivering news she knows will change a life. Someone submitted an application to Coker Capital listing 401 Ashgrove Lane as an owned asset with no liens. Whoever filled it out either doesn't understand how the trust works or is hoping nobody checks. He wouldn't do that, Odessa said, and heard, even as she said it, how much she wanted it to be true rather than believed it. Odessa, Denise's voice softened. The trust has never transferred title. Not 1 square foot. He doesn't own a doorknob in that house. But if a lender extends credit believing he does, and it comes out later that he doesn't, that's not a marital dispute anymore. That's fraud. Sometimes the moment you stop trusting someone isn't the moment they hurt you. It's the moment you finally let yourself see the hurt that was already there. She didn't confront Terrence that week. She watched instead, quietly, carefully, the way her grandmother used to watch a boarder who was 3 weeks behind on rent, gathering facts before she ever said a word. She found the second phone. She found the hotel charges. She found, eventually, a folder in his study labeled Whitash, Personal Financials, containing a net worth statement listing Ashgrove Lane at an appraised value of $780,000. Owner, Terrence Whitfield. Liens, none. She photographed every page. Then she drove to Denise Okafor's office and asked the only question that mattered. What do I actually have the right to do? Denise slid a folder across the desk. Everything, she said. You've had everything the whole time. You just never had to use it. The dinner where Simone was formally introduced to the family happened on a Sunday in October, 3 weeks before the eviction notice. Odessa was invited, Corinne insisted, in the particular tone she used when she wanted an audience for something. Odessa went. She had already spoken with Denise. She had already begun, quietly, drafting what would come. But she wanted, one last time, to watch and be certain. Corinne stood at the head of the table and raised her glass. I want to welcome Simone properly into this family, she said, as the woman who's going to be helping Terrence build the next chapter of his life. Lord knows he's earned a fresh start. Danielle reached over and squeezed Simone's hand. You're going to love that house, she said, loud enough for the whole table, loud enough for Odessa. It's got such good bones. Terrence has been talking about redoing the kitchen for you. Odessa said nothing. She watched Terrence's face carefully for the flicker of shame she still, foolishly, hoped to see. She saw instead a kind of relief, the relief of a man who believed he had finally, successfully, gotten away with something. Odessa, Corinne said, turning to her with the false gentleness of a woman delivering an instruction disguised as a courtesy. You'll want to start thinking about your own arrangements. No sense dragging this out longer than it needs to. I appreciate the concern, Odessa said, and smiled, and it was the smile that made Danielle uneasy, without being able to say why. She left the dinner early. She did not cry in the car until she was 2 blocks away, and even then, only for the length of one red light. The cruelest lies are the ones told about you, in your own house, in front of people who never once thought to ask you if they were true. She called Denise the next morning. File it, she said. All of it. Terrence learned about the eviction notice the same way his family did. Standing in the foyer, watching a deputy hold out a folder nobody wanted to take. What he did not yet understand, standing there in his loosened tie, was that the notice was not the end of what Odessa had found in that study. It was only the beginning of what everyone else was about to find out. In the days leading up to that dinner, Odessa had gone back, more than once, to the boxes she still kept in the garage from the boarding house closing. Old ledgers of her grandmother's, receipts written in careful cursive, a woman's whole working life, recorded in the margins of rent books. She hadn't opened them in years. She opened them now not out of nostalgia, but because she needed, badly, to remember what it looked like to hold something honestly. One ledger page, dated decades before Odessa was born, recorded a boarder 3 months behind on rent. A young man named Curtis Boyd who had, according to her grandmother's small looping handwriting, asked twice this week whose house this really is. Beneath it, Willa had written only, told him. His name's on nothing here, mine's on everything. A house doesn't change hands because a man decides he's tired of asking. Odessa sat on the garage floor with that ledger in her lap for a long time. She thought about how strange it was that a woman dead 11 years could still, somehow, hand her daughter exactly the sentence she needed on exactly the night she needed it. A family's history doesn't disappear just because nobody talks about it anymore. It waits, patiently, in old boxes, for the one person who finally needs to remember. She did not tell Terrence about the ledger. She did not tell him about the letter from the title company, or the folder in his study, or the 3 appointments she'd had with Denise Okafor in the previous month. She had decided somewhere in the quiet drive home from the dinner where Corinne told her to start thinking about her own arrangements that she was done handing him information before he'd earned the right to have it. She would let him keep believing, for a little while longer, that her silence meant she hadn't noticed. Silence, she was learning, could be a tool as easily as it could be a wound. The difference was only in who was choosing to wield it and why. The eviction notice, once Denise's office formally processed it, was precise in the way legal documents are built to be precise. A notice to vacate served on all unauthorized occupants of 401 Ashgrove Lane, issued by the trustee of the Willa Freeman Family Trust, citing the trust's sole ownership of the property and the absence of any lease, license, or ownership interest held by Terrence Whitfield or any other resident. 30 days. Corinne read it twice at the kitchen table, her reading glasses slipping down her nose, her mouth tightening with each paragraph. Trust, she said finally, like the word offended her personally. What trust? This is your grandmother's little boarding house money. This is Terrence's house. It's never been Terrence's house, Odessa said. It's never been in his name, not for one day of our marriage. Then why, Danielle snapped, does he talk about it like it's his? You'd have to ask him that, Odessa said. I've been asking myself the same question for about 3 weeks now. Malcolm, who had come by that afternoon under the pretense of dropping off a spare car charger and had instead walked into the middle of a family reckoning, stood quietly near the door with his arms crossed. He said nothing, but Odessa noticed, and would remember later, that he was the only one in the room not looking at her like she was the villain. The first crack in a family's story is always the person who stops nodding along. Terrence tried, in the days that followed, to manage the unraveling the way he'd always managed things, with confidence deployed loudly enough to drown out scrutiny. He told his mother the eviction notice was a scare tactic, that Odessa was just trying to punish him, that he had documentation of his own that would clear everything up. He did not have documentation of his own. What he had was a growing, cold understanding, sitting alone in his car outside the Whitash offices, that the net worth statement he'd submitted to Wallace Coker 3 months earlier, the one listing 401 Ashgrove Lane, owner, Terrence Whitfield, liens, none, was sitting in a loan file that Coker Capital's underwriting team was currently, reviewing for a second and much larger disbursement. He called Reggie. "We need to talk about the collateral on the Coker loan." "What's to talk about?" Reggie said. "Underwriting already cleared it on the first draw. We're fine." "I need you to understand something," Terrence said, and then found he couldn't finish the sentence, because finishing it meant saying out loud, for the first time, what he had been quietly avoiding saying to himself for a year and a half. "I don't own that house. I never owned that house. I told a lender I did, to get money for a business I built with your name and mine on the door." He hung up instead. He told himself he'd figure it out. Entitlement rarely arrives as a decision. It arrives as 100 small avoidances, each one small enough to forgive, until one day the debt they've built together comes due all at once. Simone found the loan file by accident, in the way that most people find the truths someone else has been protecting them from, not through detective work, but through proximity. She was updating the Whitash investor deck for a meeting and needed the finalized financials Reggie had submitted to Coker Capital. She opened the folder expecting boilerplate. She found instead a personal net worth statement with Terrence's signature at the bottom and an address she recognized instantly, because she had stood in its driveway 4 times in the last 2 months, admiring the crown molding Terrence promised they'd keep when they redid the kitchen. Owner, Terrence Whitfield. Liens, none. She sat very still for a long time. Then she called him and asked one question, carefully, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. "Terrence, whose name is the deed to Ashgrove Lane actually in?" There was a silence on the line that told her everything before he said a word. "It's complicated," he said finally. "That's not an answer. It's held in a trust, her grandmother's trust. She's the trustee. So it was never yours to promise me. Simone, you told your family the marriage was over. You told me she'd already agreed to leave. You let your own mother stand in that woman's kitchen and tell her to start packing." Simone's voice was very quiet, which was worse somehow than if she'd shouted. "Did you tell her any of that was happening? Or did she find out from a deputy at her own front door?" Terrence did not answer that question either. She had believed him because he had constructed a story careful enough to survive a family dinner. She had not realized it would not survive a single loan document. Simone did not immediately tell anyone what she'd found. She sat with it the way Odessa had sat with the title insurance letter months before, turning it over, testing which parts of her anger belonged to Terrence and which parts, uncomfortably, belonged to herself for not asking sooner. She had made a decision, months ago, to believe a convenient story instead of asking an inconvenient question. That decision was hers. What Terrence had built on top of it was his. The second wife should eventually realize she didn't replace the first one. She was used to complete a story that was never about her at all. Subscribe to Milan Folktales if you've ever watched someone's confidence collapse the moment the truth finally had somewhere to land. What happens next didn't come from Odessa raising her voice. It came from a piece of paper nobody thought she'd ever need. Wallace Coker's office called Odessa's home number on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into the 30-day notice period, asking to schedule a property appraisal in connection with a pending loan review. The assistant on the phone was polite, brisk, entirely unaware she had just handed Odessa the second half of a story she'd only had half of until that moment. Odessa called Denise Okafor before she'd even hung up the kitchen phone. "They're using the house as collateral for an active loan," she said. "Not an application. A loan. Someone extended credit believing Terrence owns this property." Denise was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted from careful to precise. the sound of a lawyer recognizing the exact size of the problem in front of her. Odessa, I need you to think very carefully. Has anyone from Coker Capital ever contacted you directly? Has your signature appeared on anything? A guarantee? A spousal consent form? Anything? No, nothing. I've never spoken to anyone from that company in my life. Good, Denise said. Then what we have isn't a family dispute anymore. What we have is a lender who was given false collateral information to secure financing. That's not just going to cost your husband his marriage, Odessa. Depending on how Coker's underwriting team wants to handle it, that could cost him a fraud referral. Odessa had spent 11 years believing the worst thing marriage could do to a person was break their heart. She was only now understanding it could also, quietly, without her ever agreeing to it, put her name in danger of a courtroom she'd never chosen to walk into. I need to know one more thing, she told Denise. Am I liable for any of this? For anything he told them? Not if the trust never signed anything, and it didn't. But Odessa, this is bigger than the eviction now. If Coker Capital learns the collateral backing their loan doesn't exist, they're going to come looking for someone to hold accountable. And your husband is about to become the only name on that list. Malcolm Whitfield showed up at Odessa's door 2 days later, unannounced, without his mother's knowledge. He stood on the porch for a long moment before she opened it, like a man rehearsing an apology he wasn't sure he had the right to give. I need to ask you something, he said. And I need you to tell me the truth, because I think I've been letting my family tell me a version of this that isn't real. Odessa let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table Corinne had sat at 3 weeks earlier, reading the eviction notice like it was an insult, and asked to see the trust documents. Not because he doubted her, because, he admitted quietly, he'd spent a month telling himself silence was neutral, and he was starting to understand that in a family like his, silence was never neutral. It always ended up serving somebody, and it had been serving his brother. He told Mama the marriage was already over, Malcolm said. He told her you'd signed something. Did you sign anything, Odessa? No, she said. I found out about Simone the same week I found out he'd been telling a bank I owned nothing, and he owned everything. Malcolm sat with that for a long time, staring at the grain of the table. I run a company, he said finally. If I told a lender I owned equipment that belonged to somebody else to secure a loan I couldn't otherwise get, that's not a gray area. That's the kind of thing that ends careers, ends people's freedom, depending on how far it goes. I know, Odessa said quietly. I should have asked sooner, Malcolm said. I let Mama's version be the only version, because asking questions in that house has never gone well for anybody who isn't her. At least one person in every family that closes ranks around a lie eventually has to decide whether loyalty means defending the story or finally asking who the story is protecting. Odessa's closest friend at the hospital, a nurse manager named Renetta Cross, had watched the whole slow unraveling from the sidelines for months, mostly in the form of Odessa going quiet during lunch breaks she used to fill with easy conversation. It was Renetta who finally asked, straight out, over cafeteria coffee gone lukewarm, "You've been carrying something for weeks. You planning on telling me, or am I supposed to keep pretending I don't notice?" Odessa told her everything. The letter, the ledger, the folder in the study, the dinner where Corinne had told her, in front of the whole family, to start thinking about her own arrangements. Renetta didn't offer sympathy first. She offered a question. What does the trust actually say you can do? Everything, Odessa admitted. I've had everything the whole time. Then why, Renetta asked gently, have you been sitting on it for a month like it's a burden instead of an answer? Odessa didn't have a clean response to that, not right away. It took her another week of turning the question over. On her drive home, in the quiet of the garage among her grandmother's boxes, before she understood it fully. She had spent 11 years married to a man who mistook her patience for permission, and some smaller, older part of her, shaped long before Terrence ever entered her life, had learned to equate keeping the peace with keeping herself safe. Serving the notice wasn't only a legal decision, it was the first time in longer than she wanted to admit that she had chosen her own certainty over everyone else's comfort. Peace that cost you the truth was never actually peace. It was only a quieter kind of surrender. She filed the paperwork 3 days later. Simone's departure from Whitash Development, once the loan review became public knowledge within the small circle of the city's development community, cost her more than she expected. 2 prospective clients quietly withdrew their interest in her consulting services, wary of association with a firm now known, in whispered rounds at industry mixers, for a founder who had lied about Collateral to secure financing. She rebuilt slowly, taking smaller contracts, working twice as hard to prove a mistake in her judgment about one man wasn't a referendum on her competence. She reached out to Odessa exactly once, nearly 8 months after the hearing, in a short, carefully worded email that took her 3 drafts to send. I want you to know I didn't understand what I was walking into. That doesn't make it hurt you any less, and I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness I haven't earned. I only wanted you to hear it from me instead of from him. Odessa read it twice before replying, briefly, the way you close a door gently instead of slamming it. Thank you for telling me the truth. That's more than he ever managed. I hope you land somewhere solid. They never spoke again after that. But Odessa found, unexpectedly, that she did not carry any real anger toward Simone, only a quiet, complicated recognition of a woman who had believed a carefully built lie because the man telling it had every incentive to make it believable. He left without promising anything specific. But 2 days later he called Odessa to tell her, quietly, that he'd be at the eviction hearing, not for Terrence, and not entirely for her either, but because he wanted, for the first time in a long time, to be in a room where the truth was actually the thing being decided. Corinne, for her part, did not soften. If anything, the growing wrongness of the situation made her dig in harder, the way people sometimes do when the ground beneath a belief starts shifting, not because the belief is getting stronger, but because letting go of it means admitting how completely they'd been willing to be led by it. He's my son, she told Danielle, when Danielle came to her, uncertain, with a rumor she'd heard about a loan investigation. Whatever mess he's in, we handle it as a family. We don't turn on him because some paperwork got complicated. Mama, if he lied to a bank, he didn't lie, Corinne said, too quickly, too firmly, the tone of a woman convincing herself as much as her daughter. He made a mistake with some forms. That house should have been his the day he married her. 11 years, and she never once put his name on anything. What kind of wife does that? She had spent so many years believing loyalty meant defending her son from consequences that she had never once asked whether the consequences might in fact be earned. Danielle didn't argue, but she noticed, for the first time, a small, cold seed of doubt settling somewhere she couldn't quite name. Not doubt about whether Terrence had lied, but doubt about whether her mother's certainty had ever actually been about the truth at all, or only ever about which side of the family line she'd decided, long before any of this started, that she was going to stand on. The property appraisal Wallace Coker's office had scheduled took place on a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before the eviction deadline. Odessa allowed it, Denise's advice, because refusing access would only muddy what needed, at this point, to be made completely, undeniably clear. The appraiser arrived expecting to walk through a property owned outright by Terrence Whitfield. Instead, Denise Okafor met him on the porch with a folder of her own. The recorded trust deed, the certificate of trust, 11 years of property tax filings, every document showing, in plain and unbroken language, that 401 Ashgrove Lane had never once, in any form, belonged to the man whose signature was on Wallace Coker's collateral file. The appraiser called his office from his car before he'd even finished his coffee. By that afternoon, Coker Capital had frozen the second disbursement to Whitash Development and opened an internal review of the collateral documentation on the entire loan. By that evening, Reggie Ashworth had called Terrence 4 times without an answer and left a 5th message that ended with, "Man, you need to call me back before this becomes a legal problem instead of a business problem." The house that Terrence had spent a year and a half quietly borrowing against without permission had never actually belonged to him for even a single day of that year and a half. And now, for the first time, the people he'd built that lie in front of were finally starting to see the shape of what he'd risked to tell it. Corinne learned about the frozen loan disbursement not from Terrence, but from a phone call with an old church friend whose son worked in commercial banking and had heard, secondhand, that Whitash Development was having some trouble with a lender. She called Terrence immediately, expecting reassurance. What she got instead was a long silence, and then a version of the truth so watered down it barely qualified as one. "It's a documentation issue," he said. "Reggie's handling it." Terrence. Corinne's voice had the particular sharpness of a mother who has spent decades learning to hear what her children aren't saying. "Did you tell that bank you owned Odessa's house?" The silence that followed answered the question more completely than anything he could have said. "I was going to fix it," he said finally. "I was going to get her to put my name on it, and then none of it would even matter." "You were going to make her put your name on something she never offered you," Corinne said, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, something in her voice cracked. Not sympathy for Odessa, not yet, but the beginning of a much harder recognition. "Terrence, I raised you better than to think a woman's patience is the same thing as her consent." It was not an apology, it was not even close to one, but it was the first sentence Corinne had said in 3 months that acknowledged, even obliquely, that her son might have done something wrong rather than simply been wronged by circumstance. She did not call Odessa that week, or the next. Pride, once it has organized a person's entire understanding of a situation, does not release its grip easily, even when the facts underneath it have already given way. But she stopped, after that phone call, repeating to Danielle that the eviction was Odessa punishing the family for no reason. She started saying, instead, more quietly, that she needed time to understand what her son had actually done. Some reckonings don't arrive as thunder. They arrive as a mother going quiet in a kitchen, turning a fact over and over, until she can no longer set it back down the way she found it. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a municipal courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, the kind of room built for small consequences that somehow, over and over, ends up holding enormous ones. Odessa arrived with Denise Okafor at her side, a folder of trust documents thick enough that the clerk asked, only half joking, if she planned to submit all of it. Terrence arrived alone. Simone had not spoken to him in 11 days, and Corinne, though she'd promised to come, called that morning to say she couldn't bear to watch it, which everyone in the family understood, without saying so, to mean she couldn't bear to watch her own certainty be proven wrong in a room full of strangers. Malcolm came anyway. He sat 2 rows behind Odessa, not beside her, not beside his brother, a small, deliberate distance that said more than any statement he could have made. The hearing had been scheduled as a routine eviction matter. It did not stay routine for long. Terrence's attorney, a young associate Reggie had found on short notice, clearly unprepared for the scope of what he was walking into, attempted to argue that Terrence held an equitable interest in the property through 11 years of marital contribution, mortgage assistance, and improvements made to the home. Denise Okafor stood, unhurried, and placed 3 documents on the clerk's table one at a time, like a woman laying down cards she'd been holding for exactly this moment. The recorded trust deed, unbroken since 1998. The certificate naming Odessa as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. And, finally, the net worth statement submitted to Coker Capital, Terrence Whitfield's own signature beneath the words owner, liens, none. Your Honor, Denise said, opposing counsel is welcome to argue equitable interest. But I'd ask the court to note that 6 months ago, my client's husband represented in writing to a private lender that he owned this property outright and free of any encumbrance, including, notably, free of any interest belonging to his wife. He cannot now argue in this courtroom that an interest exists which he swore, in a separate legal document, did not. The judge looked at Terrence for a long moment. Terrence looked at the table. Evidence does not need to be loud to be devastating. It only needs to be true in a room where the truth has finally been allowed to speak for itself. The eviction order was granted without further argument, but it was the second matter, raised almost incidentally by Denise, who had informed Coker Capital's counsel of the hearing as a professional courtesy, that turned the room from a family dispute into something else entirely. A representative from Coker Capital's legal department was present, quietly, in the back row, and asked the court's permission to enter a statement regarding a related matter under internal review, potential fraudulent misrepresentation of collateral in connection with a commercial loan. Terrence's young attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted it. Terrence sat very still in the hallway afterward, Malcolm standing several feet away, neither of them speaking. While Reggie Ashworth's texts piled up on a phone Terrence no longer had the courage to look at. Subscribe to Milan Folktales if you've ever needed proof that the truth doesn't have to shout to win. It just has to outlast the lie. If you want more stories where the quiet ones turn out to be holding all the cards, you know what to do. What followed in the weeks after the hearing was not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow, believable unraveling of the life Terrence had built on top of a house that was never his. Coker Capital's internal review confirmed what the appraiser's visit had already made undeniable. The collateral backing the second loan disbursement did not exist. The company chose not to pursue criminal fraud charges, a decision made, Odessa later learned, largely because Reggie Ashworth cooperated fully, restructured the loan against Whitash's actual business assets, and personally absorbed a significant renegotiated liability to keep the firm's name out of a courtroom. It cost him nearly everything he'd built the company on. It also, quietly, ended his partnership with Terrence, whose name came off the letterhead within the month. Terrence was not arrested. He was not publicly ruined in the way cartoonish revenge stories promise. He simply lost, one at a time, the things that entitlement had led him believe he could keep, without ever earning them honestly. His business partner, his standing in a professional community that talks quickly when trust is broken, and, finally, Simone, who filed the last of it away, the loan documents, the lies to his family, the 11 days of silence he never adequately explained, and left without asking him to change her mind. "You didn't lie to replace her," Simone told him, the last time they spoke, standing in a parking lot neither of them would remember fondly. "You lied because you wanted to be a man who already owned things, instead of doing the work of becoming one. I just happened to be standing close enough to believe you." His greatest mistake was never the affair. It was believing, somewhere underneath all his ambition, that his wife's quiet years of not arguing meant she had no power to say no. He learned in the end that she had always had the power. She had simply never needed to use it until he forced her to. Corinne's reckoning came slower and quieter, in the way that pride usually unwinds, not through a single confrontation, but through the accumulation of small, undeniable facts she could no longer arrange around her son's version of events. She did not apologize to Odessa outright, not at first. What she did, 3 months after the hearing, was show up at Ashgrove Lane on a Sunday afternoon with a pound cake and no explanation, and stand on the porch until Odessa opened the door. "I don't expect you to forgive how I acted," Corinne said. "I'm not here for that. I'm here because I raised that boy to believe the world owed him something, and I think I need to sit with what that cost everybody, including you, before I ask you for anything at all." Odessa let her in. It was not a reconciliation. It was, at most, a beginning, the kind two people build slowly, in small visits, over a long time, if they build it at all. They sat at the kitchen table, the pound cake between them, untouched for a long while. Finally, Corinne said, "I think I convinced myself loyalty meant never asking my son a hard question. I've been calling that love for 30 years. I'm starting to think it was just fear. Fear of what I'd have to admit about how I raised him if I ever let myself look too closely." "You're allowed to have raised an imperfect son," Odessa said. "That's not the same as being responsible for the choices he made as a grown man." "But you are responsible for what you do now that you know." Corinne nodded slowly, and did not argue, which was, for a woman like Corinne Whitfield, its own quiet form of surrender. She came back the following month, and the month after that, and eventually the visits stopped requiring an occasion at all. It never became easy between them. But it became honest, which Odessa had learned, over the course of that year, was worth considerably more. Danielle's reckoning was quieter still, and mostly private, a marriage of her own, built partly on a lifestyle she and her husband couldn't quite afford, strained further by her mother's public embarrassment, and her own complicity in it. She never called Odessa to apologize, but she stopped, at family gatherings after that, being the first to speak about things she didn't actually know. Malcolm's reckoning had already happened. in Odessa's kitchen, the week he chose to ask the question nobody else in his family had been willing to ask. He and Odessa remained close in the years that followed, not because the family drama had made them allies against a common enemy, but because he had proven, in the one moment it mattered, that he was capable of choosing truth over comfort. His own business relationship with Terrence, which had never been formal, but had always involved the easy give and take of brothers sharing warehouse space and the occasional referral, ended quietly in the months after the hearing. Malcolm didn't make a scene of it. He simply stopped returning calls about joint ventures, stopped inviting Terrence into deals where his name might end up standing beside his brother's on paperwork again. When Terrence finally asked him about it directly, at a subdued Thanksgiving dinner the following year, Malcolm answered without heat. "I watched you tell a bank you owned something that belonged to somebody else," he said. "I can't unsee that when I think about signing anything with your name on it now. That's not punishment, Terrence. That's just what happens when a person shows you exactly who they are under pressure. You believe them." Terrence had no answer for that either. It was, in its own quiet way, the truest verdict anyone in the family delivered to him. Not a courtroom, not a lender's fraud review, but his own brother, choosing carefully, deliberately, not to hand him the kind of trust he had already proven he didn't know how to hold. The family didn't lose Odessa's home. They lost the comfortable version of themselves they'd built while believing they had a right to it. Odessa did not sell 401 Ashgrove Lane. She had considered it, in the raw weeks right after the hearing, when every room in the house still held some echo of the marriage that had ended inside it. But her grandmother's voice kept returning to her. "A house given too easily gets treated too easily. Hold it the way I held it, with both hands." And she understood, slowly, that selling it would mean letting Terrence's betrayal decide what the house was allowed to mean for the rest of her life. Instead, she converted the unused east wing, the rooms that had once been meant, quietly, hopefully, for children who never came, into a small transitional housing program for women rebuilding their lives after divorce or displacement, run in partnership with the hospital foundation where she worked. She named it, without much deliberation, the Willa Freeman House. Some inheritances aren't property. They're the discipline to hold what's yours without needing anyone else's permission to keep it. A house doesn't become a home because someone claims it loudly. It becomes a home because someone holds it honestly, long after the people who doubted them have stopped watching. The first residents of the Willa Freeman house moved in that spring. A schoolteacher named Renata who'd left a marriage with nothing but 2 suitcases and a determination Odessa recognized instantly, and an older woman, Miss Pearl, who reminded Odessa so much of her grandmother in the way she moved through a kitchen, that Odessa found herself, more than once, standing in the doorway just watching, grateful all over again for a woman who had died believing a house held with both hands could outlast any lie told about it. Odessa did not tell every new resident the full story of how the East Wing had come to exist. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the eviction notice, or the loan file, or the year she'd spent quietly gathering the truth before she ever said a word about it out loud. What mattered was simpler than that, and had been the whole time. A woman could hold what was hers, honestly and without apology, and eventually, not always quickly, not always painlessly, but eventually, the truth would find its way to daylight on its own. Entitlement always mistakes someone's patience for their permission. Silence, in a family, is never neutral. It always ends up serving somebody. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs somewhere to finally land. You cannot build a life on a lie and call the collapse unfair when the truth finally arrives to collect what it's owed. On the 1-year anniversary of the eviction notice, Odessa sat on the back porch of Ashgrove Lane with her niece, Malcolm's youngest daughter, who had asked, with the blunt curiosity of an 8-year-old, why the house had a plaque out front with a stranger's name on it. "That was my grandmother," Odessa said. "This house is hers, really. I just get to take care of it for a while. Is that why nobody could ever take it from you?" Odessa turned the old brass key over once in her palm, the same key that had sat, months earlier, forgotten on a hallway table beside a stack of gloves nobody had ever come back to claim. "Nobody could take it," she said, "because it was never about who could shout the loudest, or who moved in the fastest, or who believed the story hardest. It was about who actually held the paper. And your great-great-grandmother made sure, a long time before any of this happened, that the paper would always tell the truth, even on the days nobody wanted to hear it. She looked out at the yard, at the late afternoon light settling gold across the grass, and did not think, for the first time in over a year, about the eviction notice, or the loan file, or the foyer full of people who had once believed they were owed something that was never theirs. She thought only of the key in her hand and what it had finally come to mean. Not possession, not victory, just the quiet, permanent fact of a home that had always, only ever, belonged to the woman who had never stopped honestly holding it.